The human brain is one of the most advanced organic computers in existence, so it makes perfect sense to combine an organic one with a mechanical one to get the benefits of both. Well, so long as one of them is stable. Jury-rigged by Joel Haldeman. Read by Karl Wallace. L. Henry Kinham put a tiny speck of ultramarine blue onto the glob of white on his palette. He smushed it around until it was thoroughly mixed and smiled. Perfect for the underside. Henry was painting a gesso and gesso picture of a pile of eggs in a white bowl and a white saucer on a white tabletop, yet uniformly from every side. It was a tour de force of technique, though an uncharitable observer might have pointed out that from any distance greater than 3 feet, it was only a slightly smudged white canvas. But Henry was untouched by the foibles of critics, more immune than any other artist in any less perfect age could have been. For in the citizens' capitals of America, and almost everywhere else for that matter, he was a painter, by damn. Occupational code 509-82763. Artist, paints, freelance, and he got a government check every 2 weeks for doing what he'd shown the most aptitude for, 20 years ago at the magic age of 14. All he had to do, to keep off the relief rolls, was to produce at least one painting a year. He'd already done his painting this year, and it made him feel like a very good citizen to be doing another. This one was quite a challenge, too. Henry hadn't seen a real egg in many years. His paycheck was adequate, but not enough to justify buying gourmet food, and disdating photographs, he was working from memory. His eggs were a little too spherical. The drawer chimed softly, and Henry gave a gentle curse and set his palette under the no-dry field. He got the brush in his hands and went to answer the door. The viewer showed 3 men in business clothes, dark blue capes and matching jockstraps, maybe customers looking for something to brighten up their office. Henry thought of the 28 canvases languishing unsold in his studio, and how nice it would be to splurge and buy an egg. He composed his features into a look of quiet interest and thumbed the door open. Louis Henry Kinham, the short fellow in the middle, did the talking while the other 2 stared. Yes, indeed, sirs. What can I do for you? Government business, the little one said, and produced a card badge with the legend, Occupational Classification Board. We have some good news for you. Oh, well, come in, come in. Good news, maybe. The 2 big fellows didn't look like a harbingers of joy. They walked in silently, as if on oiled bearings, expressions never changing as they took in the carefully planned disorder of his living room studio. Can I get you gentlemen coffee or something? No, thank you. You won't be long. Neither will you, as a matter of fact. You're to come with us. He plopped down on the sofa roll. Please have a seat. The other 2 remained standing. Henry had a strong impulse to bolt out the door, but instead he perched on a needlewood sawhorse. Why is the OCB interested in me? As I said, it's good news. You're going to be a very wealthy man. I'm not being reclassified, am I? Henry couldn't imagine being anything other than artist paints freelance. Besides, some of the highest paying jobs were unpleasant in the extreme, like sewage inspector or poison tolerance control engineer. No, nothing like that. Not really. The man took a blue envelope out of his cape pocket and fiddled with it. Your occupational code remains the same, and you'll be painting in another year. But for 1 year, you've been selected to serve on jury duty. Henry half jumped, half fell off the sawhorse. 200 staring pounds of muscle stood in a position between him and the door. You can't plug me into the machine for a year. I'll go crazy. Everyone does. Now, Mr. Kinham. The man got up, smiling, and his cronies produced handcuffs. Sure you don't believe all that nonsense? Why, nobody in the world is more comfortable than a cyborg juror. All your physical needs taken care of automatically. A good, responsible job with high pay, 8 companions, as intelligent, as qualified as you. But I'm not qualified. Don't know anything but painting. I don't want to do anything but paint. Now, don't run yourself down, Mr. Kinham. Out of the 80 million people in Bolt, Washington, Central chose you as the one most qualified to replace the outgoing juror. The machine made a mistake then. The juror runs the whole city. I can't even manage my own. One of the heaviest jingled his cuffs suggestively. Come on, Mr. Harris. Gonna be after 5 by the time you get back to the office. Looked as though that long speech had made his face hurt. Right, Sam. Look, Mr. Kinham, we can talk about it on the flyer. Why don't you just cooperate and come along? Henry went quietly. The Baltimore-Washington Richmond complex was a monument to scientific city planning. Growing methodically from the rubble of the Second American Revolution, the planners let nothing to chance or human weakness. There was no urban sprawl. Some were simply not allowed. The cities had ideally fixed populations. Everybody who was present central, the central planning and maintenance computer facility, decreed not essential to the city's function, was compelled to live in the ex-urban low-rises. Henry lived in one such, Fernwood, about 50 air miles west of the center of Washington. Only those chosen to be very wealthy could afford to live above ground. As the flyer skimmed its silent way to Washington, Harry saw a few such above-ground dwellings. Their lawns are regular patches of green, looking out of place, disturbing the geometric regularity of the produce fields that rolled from horizon to horizon. Couldn't understand why anybody would purposely expose himself to weather when he could live on a totally controlled underground environment. He was only half listening to Mr. Harris. It's ridiculous to say you aren't qualified. Center considers all citizens with IQs between 130 and 140. Any person with that level of intelligence can fulfill the cyborg function. But George is chosen for many other qualities, besides intelligence. My pretty blue eyes, he said, looking out the window. Now, Mr. Kenham doesn't want to be sarcastic. Henry was getting very annoyed at Harris's habit of addressing him by name every other sentence. You should be very proud. Of all the people intelligent enough, but not too intelligent, out of all of them, the machine decided you were the one least likely to misuse the power a juror has. I don't want power. I want the pain to be left alone. That is precisely it. Thanks. Lack of ambition. There's a lot to be proud of. It was cold in the tank. Some part of his brain knew he was floating in slime, naked as an embryo, totally helpless. That part of his brain knew the crown of his skull had been excised and stored somewhere. That from the eyebrows up he was a complicated mass of gray and blue tissue, interwoven with fine wires, microcircuitry, sensors. It would have been frightening had he been allowed to feed her. He couldn't see himself or feel anything but the cold, or hear the faint susurrus of fluid cycling through the tank. Part of his brain he used to see was earmarked for traffic control. Part of his brain he used to feel took care of population density and epidemiological research. Part of his brain used to be hooked up to his ears, supply and demand redundancy check, or sometimes resource projection analysis. A well-determined matrix was like the smell of buttercups. He had never smelled a buttercup before. The differential equation with ambivalent initial conditions felt like an itch in the middle of his back where he couldn't reach. Centers sang like harps, and algebra was more basic to him than love had ever been. He knew he had once been Louis Henry Kenham, but now he was Interface 4, and he had a splitting headache. Your head will ache for a year, said 5, speaking in cultured accents of Boolean algebra. If you can hold out for a year, said 8. The old 4 only meant 4 months, said 5. But you can do it. We have great confidence in you, said 6. Just a hint of sarcasm in the third order harmonic. Go fuck a solenoid, said 3. Give the new guy a chance. We've got to get out of here, thought 4. But his thoughts were in private. He hadn't learned how yet. Just walk away, said 8. Swim, said 6. You're in charge of traffic control, said 8. Go call yourself a flyer. Everybody quiet down and get back to work, said 1. Everybody did. 1 was interface control monitor, among other things. After a while, 4 learned how to isolate the entity that was Henry. It isn't necessary that Henry could think without being monitored, by 4 as well as the others. When Henry thought, it gave 4 what could only be described as a headache. 4 was allocated many more storage and logic circuits than he needed for the 246 duties he performed. It was no trick at all for 4 to link up a bit from here and there and a bit from there, and a bushel basket full from Budget Analysis 1985, and patch together a Henry analog. He did this just 1 microsecond after he saw it was possible. Of course, this Henry didn't know a vector from a scalar and couldn't even add up the figures in his credit book accurately, but he could tell a good pitting from a merely photographic one, what grade of synth terps mixed well with which pigment, and he could feel and hear and see and taste. But all of this sensory input came from 4. It was confusing at first. He saw the city, Walt Washington, all at once at every level. The satellite over at Chimborazo showed the city as a tiny crystal glittering on the Earth's sunset line. Aerial monitors in visual, infrared, and radio gave 3 complete, shifting, superimposed images that almost tallied with the acres of blueprints in city planning and maintenance. Traffic centers and pedestrian density monitors scrutinized every square millimeter of public property in the city and its allowed low-rises. He heard the babble of several 100,000 people talking at once, felt millions of feet on the sidewalks. Billions of impressions rushed through him, changing every tiniest fraction of a second. He knew he would have gone insane from the sheer complexity of it, but instead he perceived it as one gestalt. The city was so beautiful it made him ashamed to remember he once thought he knew what beauty was. An old woman died in not too much pain at level 243, room 178, Frederick Greenleaf Row-Rise. Henry knew that 4 had dispatched a flyer from the nearest Human Resources Reclamation Depot. It was sad as 3 children and 6 grandchildren would miss her. Maybe less sad that she'd been minced into compound after a reverent ritual to enrich the soybean fields around Frederick. But the sadness was part of the beauty, and while I was concentrating on Human Resources Reclamation, the fact slipped through him that at this moment there were 2,438 people urinating in Bolt 1000, and 4 could give them their name arranged in alphabetical order, or dip into health statistics and arrange them in order of increasing bladder capacity. And that was part of the beauty. And out of the 17,548 flyers in the air, 307 were going to run out of power before they reached their destinations. They changed their minds in midair, or they wouldn't have been allowed to launch in the first place. And of these 307, 2 had faulty warning lights and didn't know they had to land and recharge, and police fires were vectoring into them, but they might not get to HYZ 9476455 in time. But that wasn't too bad, because he was far north of the city, and at worst would fall like a dropped stone into an uninhabited cornfield. And 4 knew exactly which plants he would crush, what breed they were, and what stage of growth they were, what the projected yield would be. There was no way in the world that Henry or 4 could save the man's life if the police fire didn't reach him in time. And this painful helplessness in the face of virtual omniscience, this was part of the beauty too. 4 dipped into traffic control, vehicle decision analysis, did a quick cost versus probability of occurrence value of lost resources analysis, and found the installation of a device to prevent such an accident from happening would not be practical. Henry basked in the beauty and complexity of it for several days, while exploited on him and he wasn't alone. It was hard to really say where Henry was in the first place. 4 initially sent him up out of such odds and ends as weren't being used. When he hit that was a part of Henry was needed for something else, 4 automatically transferred the information in that bit of somewhere else. Anywhere. Didn't make much difference as long as the proper link was maintained. So the jury-rigged assemblage of memory cells, piezoelectric, nothing but the best, buffer units, ultrafiche candle files, and so on, the one in the name of Henry, scrawled all over center, flowing this way and that, shifting 100,000 tiny ways every second. Only very few elements of Henry came at all close to where his old body hung suspended in a dimly lit tank, filled with pale green synthetic mucus. 4 arranged Henry in this seemingly slapdash fashion because it was required by the ineffable machine logic he used to attack the problem. How do I get rid of this flaming headache? It was the best way he could isolate Henry without tying up too many components necessary for other problems. But there were other possible approaches. The man-machine that had been 4 before they installed Henry had tackled the problem in a different way. Smithers, the man who was Henry's predecessor, but a nice enough guy, an accountant with an IQ of 132, he'd been eligible for the cyborg jury and was among those center considered as replacements when the old 4's term was running out. Smithers' psychometric profile, unfortunately, was an error, and had held 2 slight maladies that would have disqualified him immediately. He was just the slightest bit paranoid, and he suffered little tiny, insignificant delusions of grandeur. Other than those 2 quirks, he had been the perfect man for the job. And with these small defects masked, Center exulted and sent Mr. Harris and his 2 silent buddies out to collect him. They had to use the handcuffs. Now, until they wired them up and slipped into the slime, Smithers wasn't the slightest bit mad. Not by any ordinary social standards. and all of his friends and relatives, in fact, were much farther from the all but unreachable standards of sanity that had to be met to make a perfect man-machine interface, and they all thought Smithers was rather dull. But the dash of paranoia and delusional fly specks that should have shown up on his profile were like a few individual colon bacti on an otherwise pristine dish of delicious Ager jelly. They could only grow, slowly at first, but at an ever-increasing rate, until after 4 months, Interface 1 decided that 4 could no longer function efficiently, and he was taken out of the system before he could do any harm. Smithers was decounted, and they thawed out his skull cap, fitted back on, and sent him off to a place where he would be cared for, where no one would mind he was as helpless as a newborn child, and only slightly more intelligent than a rutabaga. They carried Smithers' body away in his short-circuit vegetable brain, but he couldn't know about the rest of him. The cybernetic analog tucked away under Bolt Washman's Demographics 1983. Now certain parts of 4's memory are seldom tapped, but must not be disturbed. These are data which will never change, and which have been stored in the most efficient manner possible. One of these parts is demographics. If it ever occurred to 4 to wonder why the section for 1983 was slightly larger than 1984, all of the years to lose less space than the year following, he was too busy to do anything about it. Smithers was sandwiched in there, crowded in the 18 billion cells between health statistics and legal documents. It had not been easy for 4 to get rid of the Smithers headache by assembling analog out of spare parts and linking up to the cobwebby demographics section, but then Smithers, sensing the dissolution of his biological brain and not unreasonably wanting to live forever, erased from 4 all knowledge of the analog. In order to do this, Smithers had to sever all of his cyborg-centric connections. In fact, his only contact with anything outside of Demographics 1983 was a single link to his biological self. And as the Smithers that floated in green ooze slowly went bonkers, he affected the analog Smithers to that fine wire by a process of induction. When they took the Smithers' body away, the Smithers that remained was deaf and blind, as well as paranoid and delusional. Had to stay that way for weeks, frozen between health statistics and legal documents, reviewing the context of each every tenth of a second, just to keep from going even more batty. Even after they hooked Henry to 4, Smithers was isolated. Then, a graduate student doing research into mutative trends asked Central, which asked 1, which asked 4, how many birth defects showed up in the newborn of non-Caucasian parents in 1983. 4 opened a pass to Demographics 1983 to scoop out the number, and Smithers pounced on the opening, and his awareness spread through all of 4 in a nanosecond, and he kept it quiet. It was good to have the city back again, even if he had to share it with that arty-farty type Henry. He was able to see and hear and feel again, but he didn't dare reach out and touch. If 4 found out he was still there, he'd erase Smithers in a simple space-saving reflex. She was like an almost omniscient paraplegic, but before he'd been a paraplegic wrapped in a cocoon. Henry sensed that something was different. With the help of 4's cyborg diagnostic package, he checked out his own system in minutest detail. Nothing seemed to be wrong. Eventually he dismissed the somebody looking on my shoulder feeling of just understanding to which he had to adjust. Smithers kept still as a mouse while the cyborg diagnostic patches coursed up and down the system that linked him, through Henry and 4, to the outside world. It was all he could do to keep from laughing at his own cleverness as he made the process appropriate to an inert cybernetic component each time the package tested him. It was so easy to outwit. Obviously, Smithers thought, Henry's not fit to be in charge of 4, though he wasn't really in charge. It was only what Smithers remembers his job as having been. But taking over, or at least merging, would be difficult. Smithers mulled it over for 5 days. The thing that made it difficult was Henry's lack of a concrete, easily determined position. Not even 4 could predict where Henry's, say, critical faculties would be at 100th of a second in the future. 4 shifted the individual parts of Henry around on a real-time basis, whether it would depend on what was available at the moment. So Smithers wanted to get at the 4 through Henry. It became apparent that obviously the only way he could do that, which sneak in on Henry, was through 4. The distance that various parts of Henry occupied were assigned by a small, refrigerator side, component of 4, called subprogram linking algorithm, linked to its friends. There was a path to link from every subprogram in 4. Smith looked around and found it was the largest vacant place in current population dynamics. Insinuated to part himself into that vacancy, generated a request for information from Demographics 1983, his old home base. When Link passed the two of them together, Smithers slipped into Link as smoothly as an oyster sliding down a throat. From there it was easy. Assuming that nobody would need data from demographics for the next minute or so, Smithers erased all of the irreplaceable information in demographics from 1985 to 2012. He dumped Henry in there with plenty of room to spare. With Link it was easy. The rest of Fork functioned quite smoothly. Since Smithers was in charge of Link, there was no way Fork could know it had just lost a large sub-program. Of course, neither did Henry know he was being nailed down in one place. Had he cared to know where he was at any time, he would have had to patch through Link into 4, then back to Link and finally back to himself. The process taking about 2 microseconds, by which time he'd be somewhere else altogether. So he launched and stopped bothering. Smithers studied Henry as a lepidopterist might scrutinize a very important pin specimen. It took about 45 seconds to find the weakest point on the analog, the place most susceptible to invasion. He sneaked in, then gradually restored Henry to his usual status in regard to Link. That is, flashing around the system like a cybernetic dervish. He also took time to fill up the demographics area he had erased, with reasonable looking but totally made up data. That almost proved Smithers' second undoing. The graduate student who had asked for the number of birth defects in children born to non-Caucasian parents in 1983 wrote the number down on a slip of paper and used the paper for a bookmark and returned the book to the library. When he realized he lost it, he cussed a little and punched up the Central again. Central admonished him that computer time didn't come all that cheaply, and asked the one who asked for and fished out the bogus figures that Smithers had substituted. Then the graduate student went back to his desk, and the fellow that shared a room with him said the library had called, left a slip of paper in the book, and looked as if it might be important, so he might accompany it down and left it on his desk. He thanked him and cussed a little more, under his breath this time, glanced at the figure as it sat down. Then he looked at the piece of paper in his hand and booked the number on his desk. He groaned and stomped back to Central Console. "Hey, 4," one said. "Want to spill your Demographics 1983 and run a redundancy check?" "Sorry, Chief, no data to compare it to. That's all singular, no cross-referencing." "Well, find some. Give me 2 different responses the last time about a week apart." "What's up?" said 6. "Got any quarterly stuff for Demographics 1983, 4 asked. Just automobiles and flyers owned by age group, sex, and race. Well, stuff in the stack's 271. Put my version in 272 to run a no carry and through it. Okay, fire when ready, 4. "Oh shit," said 4. "Well," said 1. "No correlation. Somebody scrambled it." 1 sighed a cybernetic sigh. "Find out how far it goes and replace as much of the missing data as we can. Jesus Christ, if he doesn't have enough trouble with Labor Day coming up." "Sorry, Chief, I really am." "Not your fault, 4. Probably got randomized when they were installing a new org. Happens sometimes." Henry was listening to this exchange with great interest. After all, he was the new org. But Smithers had stopped lifting after the first evidence they'd stumbled onto his machinations. Had to put an escape plan into effect. He had several plans, as one might imagine, concerning his extreme paranoia, but since time was probably limited, he chose his quickest, most audacious one. The first thing he had to do was take over Henry completely. This would have been an impossible week before, when Henry had been totally sane. It had taken 4 months for Smithers to go off the deep end, but he had started with only the slightest hint of instability. Henry had the benefit of coexisting for a week with a full-fledged lunatic. A week was more than enough. The vague feeling of somebody looking over his shoulder intensified. Henry assured that everybody, Link, 4, 1, and every interface and package, was spying on him, sneaking stares whenever his attention was directed elsewhere. And he had a growing feeling he was just too fine and capable an analog to put up with that kind of indignity. So taking over the analog, Smithers wasn't interested in the corporeal Henry, not just yet. It was very easy, since both of them had similar pathological personalities. He merely sidled alongside and subverted Link by switching on a bogus control subprogram, severed the connection between the Henry analog and both the Henry body and 4. Taking less than a microsecond, he forced key links between himself and the other analog. For a tiny flash, he felt what the other was feeling, isolation and agony, like being swaddled in black velvet and skewered by 100 red-hot knitting needles. Then he connected up again. "What's going on?" said 4. Working fast now to stay ahead of 4. Smithers felt a slight resistance pushing in from Henry's brain, which was still fairly sane. But human thought is so grindingly slow compared to cybernetic, he didn't have a chance. Smithers pushed back at every point, and abandoning the analog, speared into the brain, the outward side being a small smoky bubble that formed where a flap of grey matter throbbed in response to the higher voltage going through a microcable, using the brain as a springboard, burning out completely, crashing into 4 with a force so compelling it randomized traffic control and made cyborg diagnostic package come out all ones. "What did you say, 4?" said 1. "Bongo, bongo, bongo, I don't want to leave the Congo," Smithers muttered. "What?" "'Twas brillig," Smithers shouted, and the saliva... Everything went red and slow and stopped, and Smithers could hear through 1,000 miles of cotton. God damn it, I had to cut out 4 again. "You all know what to do?" A ragged chorus of tired, "Yeah, Chief," as the other interfaces took over. "Good. Going to see what the trouble is this time." "Careful, Chief," Smithers recognized Seven's nasal tone. "Must be another crazy." "I can handle him. Handle the other all right." Smithers laughed, and what passed for his ears, the laugh was a chittering squirrel and a kettle drum and everything in between. He tensed and waited for contact with 1, knowing the big dumb boob would try the same old diagnostic macro algorithm he'd used last time. And as soon as he made contact, the timing was very critical, as 4 couldn't function for him without a viable brain that circuits. But 1 will want to check it out while it was still clicking hopefully. There, just the last of touches. Smithers jumped. It was like jumping in a shadow, no resistance. For a nanosecond he thought, too easy, must be a trap. But then he slid straight to the micro-algorithm into the vitals of 1. Shut out tenders of control, getting pretty good, as he thought, and clawed his way into the central processing unit. There was just a little resistance. He elbowed aside, and no time he was in charge of 1, which controlled Central, which controlled the Baltimore, Washington, Richmond computer. The idea of them trying to stand in his way, the sneaky little tricks, the spying, they'll pay. Catch the crazy chief? Sure, everything's under control. He flexed his cyborg muscles, felt those 7 working interfaces respond. Now an exercise. Wouldn't it be nice, he thought, to get everybody whose name begins with A? What'd you do with him? Contacting him was easy, from Elberg to Azelstein. He had 5 sent each an urgent communication, an order actually, urging him to meet at the Chesapeake Fission Station at noon. He had 7 arranged for tables and box lunches on the grounds of the station, and a podium with flags waving, all strictly diversionary devices. Nothing to it. I set up. Funny he couldn't see or feel as much through 1 as he had through 4. Guess only the flunkies needed extensive sensory inputs. 6 was in charge of power generation and dispersal. Smithers ordered them to pull the dampers out all the way at the Chesapeake Fission Station at 12:05. Wouldn't explode, of course, but it would get mighty hot. A transfinite ordinal simulator. Time sure flies when you don't have much to do. 1 didn't seem to have a tenth as much to do as 4 did. That's why he was always shouting orders and spying. Nothing better to occupy his time. Let's record his fantasies as he carries them out. Should have done it last time. Here it was 12:05 already. 6 reported the deed done and felt a slight voltage shift as they switched to emergency generators. Couldn't see the result of his experiment, but you can imagine all those people sitting around munching on fried soy chicken 1 second, and the next second superheated radioactive steam, flaying the skin and flesh from their bones. I should teach them a second. Jumped right the bait, didn't suspect a thing. I've recorded a minute or so for analysis and pulled the plug. Henry, that was 4's org, was in on it. Pulled him out of the circuit and plugged in the old 4 org from St. Elizabeth. Go back to normal in a couple of minutes. Now for the bees. The end.